Ethan Carter sat in the back row of his English literature class, pretending to take notes as Mr. Daniel Lawson read aloud from a classic novel. The teacher's voice, steady, rich, and deliberate, had a way of pulling students into the story, but for Ethan, it did something more. It unsettled him. At 18, Ethan had always considered himself pragmatic, someone who saw the world as it was. But Mr. Lawson made him question everything. The way he carried himself, effortlessly confident yet approachable, made Ethan feel drawn to him in ways he could neither control nor understand. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, something unspoken. Mr. Lawson had been teaching at Eastbrook High for 5 years, well respected for his passion and ability to connect with students. He had a way of making literature feel alive, turning dry texts into lessons about life, love, and morality. Ethan was among the best in his class, but when Mr. Lawson spoke, it wasn't the books he was learning about, it was himself. For months, Ethan kept his feelings hidden, convincing himself they were fleeting, a mere fascination. But the more he tried to push them away, the stronger they became. Every fleeting glance, every small encouragement, every casual touch on his shoulder sent his mind into turmoil. He knew it was wrong, impossible even, but emotions were never logical. One evening, after class, Ethan lingered by the doorway, pretending to organize his notes. Mr. Lawson was at his desk, absorbed in grading. Ethan's heart pounded as he hesitated, gathering the courage to speak. "Mr. Lawson," he finally said, his voice steadier than he felt. The teacher looked up and smiled. "Ethan, need help with something?" For a moment, words failed him. He wanted to say so much, to confess, to ask if he had ever noticed the way Ethan looked at him, the way he hung onto his every word. Instead, he shook his head. "Just wanted to say I really liked today's discussion. The way you explained Gatsby's longing. It made sense." Mr. Lawson chuckled, closing his gradebook. Fitzgerald had a way of capturing the ache of wanting something just out of reach. Sometimes, people spend their whole lives chasing something they can never have. Ethan swallowed hard. Did Mr. Lawson know? Could he sense the storm raging inside him? He wanted to believe there was an unspoken understanding between them, but deep down he knew the truth. Days later, Ethan overheard Mr. Lawson speaking with another teacher in the faculty lounge. "Students get crushes all the time," he said casually. "It's normal. They grow out of it." Ethan's stomach twisted. To Mr. Lawson, it was nothing, a fleeting, inconsequential phase. But to Ethan, it was everything. That night, he poured his heart onto paper, writing an anonymous letter. He didn't expect a response. He just wanted Mr. Lawson to know. He folded the letter, his hands trembling, and slipped it into Mr. Lawson's desk before walking away. Time had a way of dulling certain memories, but some emotions refused to fade. 10 years had passed since Ethan Carter had last walked the halls of Eastbrook High. Yet as he stepped through the familiar corridors, a wave of nostalgia crashed over him. The faint scent of old books, the muffled chatter of students, the distant echo of a school bell. It all felt unchanged, as if the past had been waiting for his return. Ethan had moved on, or so he had convinced himself. He had left for college, built a career as a writer, and even found love along the way. Temporary, fleeting love, but love nonetheless. And yet, as he stood in the faculty lounge, awaiting the start of the school's annual literature event where he was invited to speak, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. He was about to see him again. Mr. Lawson, or rather, Daniel Lawson. He wasn't Ethan's teacher anymore. He was just a man, one who had unknowingly shaped Ethan's past in ways he had never understood. When their eyes met across the crowded library, Ethan expected something. Recognition, surprise, maybe even hesitation. Instead, he was met with a warm, effortless smile, the same one Mr. Lawson had given to countless students before. "Ethan Carter," Lawson said, extending a hand. "Look at you. A published author, no less." Ethan shook his hand, the touch brief yet grounding. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Lawson." "Daniel," he corrected. "No need for formality anymore." Ethan nodded, but the name felt foreign on his tongue. They spoke in fragments, questions about life, career, fleeting mentions of the past. Mr. Lawson, it seemed, had barely changed. His voice still carried that same steady cadence, his expressions just as composed. But to Ethan it was different now. He was no longer the wide-eyed student hanging on to every word. He was a man who had long since learned that love, when unspoken, had a way of turning into a shadow that followed you wherever you went. As the evening went on, Ethan watched Mr. Lawson interact with colleagues, old students, the next generation of dreamers. He was still the same person, kind, charismatic, effortlessly admired. But for the first time, Ethan saw him as he truly was. Not an unreachable ideal, not a figure of longing, just a man, living his life, blissfully unaware of the love Ethan had once harbored for him. A part of him had hoped for something, an acknowledgement, a flicker of recognition. But there was nothing. Mr. Lawson remembered him, yes, but not in the way Ethan had long imagined. And just like that, the past threatened to slip into silence once more. But Ethan wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. So he asked, his voice casual but deliberate, "Do you remember receiving an anonymous letter from a student years ago?" For the first time that evening, Mr. Lawson hesitated. For the first time that evening, Mr. Lawson hesitated. The easy smile faltered, replaced by something unreadable. He set his drink down, fingers tapping lightly against the glass as he considered Ethan's question. "A letter?" he echoed, his brow furrowed slightly, searching his memory. "I received a few anonymous notes over the years, but—" "Why do you ask?" Ethan's chest tightened. He had spent a decade carrying the weight of that letter, its words seared into his mind. And yet, to Mr. Lawson, it was just one of many. "Because I wrote it," Ethan admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. Mr. Lawson's expression shifted, mild surprise, followed by something else. Regret, curiosity, whatever it wasn't recognition. "I see," Mr. Lawson said carefully. He exhaled, leaning back slightly. "That was a long time ago, Ethan." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "Not for me." A pause stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Ethan had imagined this moment for years. He had hoped, irrationally, foolishly, that hearing the truth would bring some kind of relief. Instead, all he felt was exposed, like reopening an old wound only to find it had never truly healed. Mr. Lawson sighed, his gaze distant. "I remember reading that letter. It was heartfelt, but I never knew who wrote it. I assumed it was just—" He stopped himself, but Ethan already knew how the sentence would end. "A teenage crush," Ethan finished for him. Mr. Lawson didn't deny it. "Ethan, I was your teacher. Even if I had known, nothing would have changed. Couldn't have, couldn't, not wouldn't." The distinction wasn't lost on Ethan. "But did it mean anything to you?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He hated how raw he sounded, but he needed to know. "Even just a little?" Mr. Lawson hesitated again, choosing his words carefully. "I cared about all my students. I wanted the best for them. But what you were feeling, it wasn't real, Ethan." "Felt real, I don't doubt that, but you were young. You saw me as something I wasn't." Ethan clenched his fists under the table. He had expected rejection, but not dismissal. "Not like this. You don't get to tell me what was real." Ethan said, his voice steadier now. You don't get to decide that for me. Mr. Lawson exhaled, rubbing his temple. I didn't mean to diminish your feelings. Ethan, even if I had known, my answer wouldn't have been different. I was in love with someone else back then. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Ethan had always feared that he had been invisible to Mr. Lawson. Now, he realized it was worse, he had been irrelevant. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet Mr. Lawson's gaze. If you had known it was me back then, Ethan asked, voice hollow, would anything have changed? Mr. Lawson didn't answer right away, and that silence was an answer in itself. Mr. Lawson's silence stretched between them, heavier than any words could have been. Ethan held his breath, waiting, hoping, but deep down, he already knew. No, nothing would have changed. Not then, not now. Slowly, Mr. Lawson exhaled, his expression unreadable. Ethan, I never meant to hurt you. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. You didn't. Not really. I did that to myself. And wasn't that the truth? For years, he had clung to the hope that there had been something unspoken between them. A hidden thread, a missed opportunity. But standing here now, facing the man he had once loved so desperately, he saw things clearly for the first time. Mr. Lawson had never been a possibility. He had only ever been a lesson. Ethan straightened, pushing back the wave of old emotions threatening to pull him under. I used to think if I ever saw you again, I'd ask why. Why you never noticed, why you never said anything. But I realize now it doesn't matter. Mr. Lawson watched him carefully. Then why did you bring it up? Ethan thought about that for a moment. Because I needed to hear the truth from you. And because he hesitated, then forced himself to say it. Because I needed to let it go. Mr. Lawson's shoulders eased, and he nodded, understanding. I'm glad you found your way, Ethan. You've built something for yourself. That matters more than anything in the past. And maybe he was right. Maybe the past only held the weight you gave it. Ethan had spent years carrying something that no longer served him. Now it was time to set it down. With a deep breath, he extended a hand. It was good seeing you, Daniel. The name felt strange on his tongue, but also freeing. Mr. Lawson, Daniel smiled, taking his hand in a firm, brief shake. You too, Ethan, and that was it. No grand revelations, no lingering regrets. Just two men who had once shared a moment in time, now walking separate paths. As Ethan stepped out into the cool night air, he felt something shift inside him. He had come looking for closure, but closure wasn't something you found in another person's words. It was something you chose for yourself. For the first time in years, he felt light, free. He glanced up at the vast, endless sky and smiled. Some loves stay with you, not because they were meant to last, but because they were meant to teach you something. And Ethan had finally learned.